I'm David Susan, and this is Inside the Leader's Mind, where what's in the way becomes the way, where we look at how the obstacles we overcome allow us to leverage greater leadership skills. With me today, my guest is Martin Pritikin. He is the VP and Dean of Purdue Global Law School. It is the only fully online law school in the United States. And what's fascinating to me is at Purdue, they don't have a brick and mortar law school. So we're going to learn more a little bit about this. What is fascinating to me with my early conversation with Martin is really the leadership it takes to take on doing something like this here in the U.S. So Martin, welcome, and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you very much. One correction, we are not the only online law school. We were the first. There are a handful of others now.
See, I already messed that up, so I appreciate that.
Hey, what's in the way became the way, so we'll move
there
forward.
You go. I love it. So I would love to hear a little bit of your journey to getting where you are today and a little bit more about kind of what some of the challenges with doing what you do here with Purdue Law. So feel free to kind of share a little bit with our listeners.
Sure. So, I was a very traditional student. I went straight through from high school to college to law school. I attended Harvard Law School. When I graduated, I went straight to a big firm, kind of took the very, traditional path. And after several years of practicing, I became somewhat disenchanted with, full-time practice, especially at a large firm. And I'd always had in the back of my mind that if I wasn't loving litigation, I'd grown up on a steady diet of LA law, thinking I was going to be a hotshot trial attorney, and then you actually get into practice, you realize it's 90% discovery and motion practice, right? So I was in the back of my head that I would want to go into academia. I love teaching, I love mentoring, I love coaching people, and so as soon as I paid off,
I want to interject here a little bit because you shared something, and it's not like you were at the bottom of your class, like you were a rock star.
I was magna cum laude. I was on the Harvard Law Review. Frankly, I had options, right?
Right.
And I could have made partner at the firm, but, I kind of saw the path that led to other people where it was, as they say, the pie eating contest where the prize is more pie. And so I went into academia full time. For a number of years it was great, but then I became somewhat disillusioned as I saw that the predominant mode was that people didn't really focus on teaching students. I mean, they liked teaching and they cared about their students, but it wasn't the main focus. The main focus was on publishing, was on speaking at prestigious conferences, and that didn't really do it for me. Like for me, teaching was about preparing the next generation of lawyers to go out and serve clients. And one of the big turning points for me was actually a situation where I became a client because my wife and I, we bought our first home. It was an old house built in the 1920s, and we're in California. And so we hired a construction company to do some foundation work to help make it earthquake safe. And they didn't do a good job. And long story short, our bathtub was slowly sinking into the ground. And someone else came out and told us, yeah, they did a shoddy job. They lied to you. They drilled into soft concrete. They didn't even do the supports they said they did. And I don't know the first thing about construction. I know litigation, but I don't know construction. And so I didn't know how to do a construction litigation case, and I didn't have the time to do it. I had a full-time job. And so I tried finding a lawyer to help me. And basically, no one would do it for less than $300 an hour. And I paid a $3,000 retainer within the first month. They'd written a letter and made a couple of phone calls and burnt through the whole thing. And they said, you got to re-up. Now, I'm certainly not poor, but I'm not rich. And I said, I can't afford this. I had, represented multi-billion-dollar companies. I'd done pro bono cases, but I'd never sort of dealt with the vast middle where regular working class folks, they have legal problems. Maybe there's not $1 million at stake. Maybe there's tens of thousands, maybe 100,000. But, for most people, they can't afford lawyers. And that's what finally woke me up to that. I got interested in access to justice. And I tried to get my former brick and mortar law school involved in a legal incubator. Now, legal incubators are programs that help law school graduates launch and grow their own solo practices with a focus on access to justice. So they're usually encouraged or sometimes required to devote a portion of their practice to pro bono or so-called low bono services, discounted services for modest means
Right.
clients. And I had students who said, hey, this sounds great. I've got $200,000 in loans. I can't afford to hang out a shingle and represent the little guy. I have to take the highest paying job I can and start hacking away at this debt. And that's what woke me up to how the high cost of legal education translates into the high cost of legal services.
Wow.
The other piece of the puzzle was I got interested in technology and legal education. I was the first professor at my law school. This was back in, I don't know, maybe 2013 or so, that developed a hybrid online course for my evidence class. And so, those two focuses, access to justice and technology, it was really serendipitous because what happened was Purdue Global Law School came along, and back then it was known as Concord Law School, and they were the nation's first fully online law school. They were founded in 1998, back when most people, if they had an internet at all, they had dial-up, right? So it was really audacious to try an online law school, but they were looking to see about acquiring a campus for accreditation reasons, which I can get into in a couple of minutes. And so they were looking at possibly buying our law school. I was associate dean at the time. The dean was out of town. She said, these folks are coming in, show them around, give them the tour. I showed them around and gave them the tour. They ended up not buying the law school, but they ended up buying me. So they were looking for a dean, and it worked out perfectly, and I jumped ship. And frankly, a lot of people, including one of my best friends who went to prestigious law schools, they said, are you crazy? You're going to go to a non-American Bar Association online law school? Like, what are you doing? And I said, no, I think this is going to be a good thing. And I took a shot, and that was 9 years ago, and it's been the best decision I ever made.
I have to be frank with you. I thought the same thing when I heard your story. I was like, what were you thinking? And you look at as I look at leaders, I mean, that takes a lot of guts to look at that and say, hey, I can do this, but the word that comes to mind is perseverance, because it's kind of like pushing a rock up a hill, maybe, if it's not accredited. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and just that mindset you have that keeps you persevering, because there's got to be some adversity, I'd guess. Yes?
There was a lot of adversity, more so once I took the job than in deciding to take the job. So, not to get too much into the weeds, but I think it's important to provide some context, right? So the American Bar Association, at least for now, is the entity deputized by the Department of Education to accredit law schools nationally. And the ABA doesn't decide who sits for the bar. Each state's Supreme Court, in most instances, decides who sits for their bar. But in almost all instances, they had said, well, if you want to sit for our bar exam and become a lawyer in our state, you have to have attended an ABA-approved law school. Now, the thing is, the ABA will not currently approve a fully online law school. The sort of cruel irony with that is that if you're a campus-based law school, you can get ABA approval. And then once you have it, you can get ABA permission to offer an online program. But if you're a fully online law school that doesn't have a campus, you can't apply for ABA approval in the first place.
And to clarify, let's say a brick and mortar has a fully online. Is it comparable to what you guys do fully online?
So comparable in terms of quality, in terms of cost. Those are two big questions.
Well, let's talk about that.
Okay, right. So I'll take cost first. So right now there are 197 ABA-approved law schools in the country. 22 of them are listed as having hybrid or fully online program options. The campus-based programs at those 22 schools, if you look at all 3 years, is $153,000. That's the average tuition cost. Those schools' hybrid or online programs is $151,000. So it's almost identical. Right? The schools aren't charging less for their hybrid online programs, and I understand why. They don't want to cannibalize themselves, right? If I say, hey, I could go to X school for $50,000 a year in person or $20,000 a year online, why would I go in person? It's the same degree. I can save a bunch of money, and frankly, a lot of people would prefer to go online these days, right? Our law school costs $53,000 all in, right? So we're a third of the cost of the traditional schools. Now, you may say yes, but can it be as high a quality? I would argue it's better quality. right? Because one of the things about having to do it online is you have to bake in a lot of the content into the online learning management system before the class ever launches, which means you have to go through the process that the ABA is actually recommending traditional schools do, right? Which is start with your outcomes in mind first. What do you want students to know, to be able to do, and to value by the time they finish this course? Those are your course outcomes. And then you work backwards from there and say, okay, well, how are we going to make sure they know this information? How are we going to make sure they know how to do these things? Through what means? Is it going to be lectures? Is it going to be videos? Is it going to be readings? How are we going to assess them to make sure that they're understanding this material and are being inculcated with these skills? And so there's a big focus on formative assessment, checking in frequently with low-stakes assessments throughout the semester to make sure they're getting it, right? So our curriculum integrates the latest research in distant learning and adult learning education with best practices in legal education. And in survey evidence, our students have rated their educational experience more highly than ABA schools, including things like critical thinking, right? Everyone says law school teaches you to think like a lawyer. Our students rate it better. Legal research and writing skills, oral advocacy skills, right? Even though we don't have in-person classes, we still have live classes, just like you and I are talking live, right? And we're showing that you can do all the things that a traditional law school can do. We have a competitive moot court program. Our students practice online and they go to in-person competitions. They compete against students at brick and mortar law schools. They've won awards for brief writing and oral advocacy. We have an externship program where students can get credit for working in a law firm or other professional setting. We have a clinic. We have independent studies where students can write detailed papers under the supervision of professors. We have experiential electives like trial advocacy and negotiations, right? All the things that you can get from a traditional law school, you can get from us, and for a third of the cost. So
that's amazing.
When I joined, I said, hey, this model makes so much more sense, right? It's a third of the cost. You don't have to give up your job or move to be near campus, right? So our students can still work while they go to law school. So, they graduate with a lot less debt. They've got more flexibility in terms of what they can afford to do when they graduate. And frankly, if they don't pass the bar exam right away or they don't get that dream law job right away, at least they're putting food on the table and they can service their debt. And so I said, why aren't more people doing this? And I quickly realized there's a couple of reasons. The typical 22-year-old college grad, they're not looking at us because they're just looking at U.S. News and World Report rankings, and we're not even on there because we're not part of the ABA, right? Instead of ABA approval, we're accredited by the State Bar of California. California is one of the only states that will accredit law schools independently of ABA approval. So for the whole history up until last year, California was the only bar exam that our grads could sit for. But 2/3 of our grads live outside of California. So, the question is, well, what are they doing? And there was a mishmash of things they can do. There's certain federal practice areas. They maybe can get eventual licensure in other states after having practiced in California for a certain number of years. They can do remote representation of California clients. There's sort of a patchwork of things. But the reality is people want to be able to sit for the bar exam where they are, and they want to be able to practice whatever type of law they want to practice. And so I said, okay, well, as I mentioned, the ABA doesn't decide who sits for the bar. It's the states that decide who sits for their bar. So I said, why don't I cut out the middleman? I'll go straight to the states and say, hey, let our grads sit for your bar exam. We're not ABA approved, but so what? We've got great students. We've got great faculty. We've got a great curriculum. Let our grads sit. If they can't pass the bar exam, they won't become lawyers. If they can pass the bar exam, they should become lawyers, right? So give us a shot. So this was back in 2016 when I first became dean. And I researched all 50 states, and I picked half a dozen states to take a run at because, it's hard to do all 50 at once. It takes a lot of work to prepare these, petitions to state supreme courts and whatnot. And they all said no. And I said, okay, well, to the extent that they explained why they said no, I'm going to tick off every one of those reasons, and I'm going to fix them, and then I'm going to go back and do it again.
I love that perseverance.
I mean, what else can you do, right? Like
Right.
if you just say, "Oh, they said no," then you just stagnate and you just, slink away with your tail between your legs, and I mean, I'm not doing my job, right? My job is to move the school forward and to move online legal education forward. And so I can't change the decision makers. All I can do is change the decision criteria, right? Change things about us.
Right.
So there were basically, 4 or 5 reasons they gave why they said no. The first one is that we were for profit at the time. Well, so I can't take credit for this, but we were acquired by Purdue University, based in Indiana, in 2018. So fortunately, that solved that problem. Another big problem they said is, well, you're online. How can you have law school online? We can't even wrap our heads around this. Remember, this was in 2016, 2017. So I went out, I created a virus. No, I'm kidding. I did not create COVID. I would not take credit for that. But the reality is
Timing worked out for a lot of people.
COVID helped. Or, I mean, I hate
Yeah.
to say it, but COVID was very good for us. And I
Well, you know
actually,
what? I thought about that. It was a paradigm shift for all over the world.
it
That
really
the
was.
mindset of we have to be physically here, and now it's the ability to do what you and I, podcasts used to be, you had to be in the same room.
Exactly, right?
So it changed everything. So continue.
And the funny thing is, I was actually worried at first that COVID was going to make us irrelevant because, our special niche was that we were online and virtually nobody else was. All of a sudden, the whole country's online. I'm like, what makes us special? But that's when I realized there's online and there's online, right? Most
Make the
people,
pie bigger too.
right, they switched to it in an emergency and they did it grudgingly and they didn't know how to do it well. And the second they could go back to going in person, almost all of them went back to going in person, right? So that's when I saw that there was a niche for us. And so that helped with that. The other thing was, I got our bar pass rates up, right? Because people said, well, hey, if you're so great and your students are so great, how come your bar pass rates aren't as high as the traditional schools? So I said, okay, we're going to work on that. And we did, and we got our bar pass rates up where we are now competitive with the traditional schools. So then I went back again, right? So 2022, this was 6 years after our first failed attempt. And this time, frankly, I also thought about working smart, not just hard. And I approached Indiana because we had sort of a connection with Indiana because of Purdue. And even with that home court advantage, it was a 2.5-year process. And, one of the arguments I made to them was that, you, Indiana, like virtually every state in the country, you have an access to justice crisis, particularly in rural areas, right? People joke about there being too many lawyers. That might be true in the big metropolises, but in the rural areas and small towns, there's not enough lawyers.
Right.
And it's a real problem. The courts are the ones who really recognize this because they're the ones who see the unrepresented litigants coming to court and the bad outcomes they have. So I said, look, you've had states who've tried things like paying people to move to rural areas. It doesn't work for the most part because if I'm an urban lawyer, you couldn't pay me enough to live in a rural area, frankly, right? And so my argument was the best way to get more lawyers in underserved areas is to make it easier for people who already live in those areas to stay where they are while they go to law school, and they'll stay where they are after they graduate law school by going to law school online, right? And there was evidence of that in California, not a very rural state, but our students are overrepresented in rural areas, whereas attorneys are underrepresented. And I said we could do the same thing in Indiana. So they gave us a shot. So in July of 2024, Indiana became the first state in history, besides California, to let our grads sit for its bar exam. And then in October of 24, Connecticut became the second state.
Cool.
And February of 2025 was the first administration of the bar exam, because they only give it twice a year. First time that our grads could sit as first-time students in states outside of California. We had 8 grads sit outside of California, 7 passed. We had an
That's
88%
awesome.
bar pass rate. So we actually had a 100% pass rate in California. Not California, Indiana. We had a 100% pass rate in Indiana. We beat the statewide average there. We beat the statewide average in Connecticut. We tied the statewide average in California. And so we finally had the chance, after almost a decade of me being there, to say, hey, if you would just let our grads sit, they could do just as well or better than the ABA students. And that's exactly what they did. And so now we're trying to capitalize on that momentum and get other states to let our grads sit as well.
It's interesting as you look at leadership and what that takes. It is the persistence, but it's also the vision. Because it would be so easy for people when there is obstacle to quit because it's a big obstacle, right? And I think it really says a lot about you to really continue to push through and have that vision. I actually had a conversation with someone last week. We were talking about Apple, and I think it's Guy Kawasaki who is their evangelist. And that's really what you are. I mean, in a way, it sounds like you kind of are the evangelist. Would you agree? Because it's amazing to me what you do.
I would. Obviously, the vehicle that I'm, doing this through is Purdue Global Law School, but I really am an evangelist, I think, for online legal education. And it helps, right? I think like any good evangelist, I really believe it, right? This isn't just, a sales pitch. I really believe in the ability of online law school to bring down cost and expand access. It's obviously not for everybody. There should be the brick and mortar option for people who want it. But if people want that online option, they should be able to choose it. We've had amazing stories, people who, took their final exams from hospital beds, people who are on active duty in Iraq or Afghanistan, right, taking our program. People in the military who just are moving around the country every year or two. They don't know they're going to be near the same, law school campus for the entire 3 or 4 years it takes. People with, serious disabilities, people who have farms, who can't leave their animals to, even go to night school. So I really believe in it. I think it's important both for the students and the clients they would come to serve. And so if you're on the right side, I think it makes it easy, right? You say, okay, well, this should happen. Instead of saying, okay, well, can it happen? It's no, this should happen. What do I need to do to make it happen? And then you just follow those steps.
So what do you see from a leadership role? What do you see as the biggest challenge you deal with regard to staff, the people that have to do the work? Because it's not a one-man show, right? So what do you see as your biggest challenge with managing, leading people?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges is connecting the dots between the day-to-day and that big picture vision, right? Because, people are focused on their task, and, it happens to me too, right? You get very sucked into the day-to-day, and it's easy to lose sight of what's the end goal, right? And so, periodically reminding them, giving them pep talks, right? Reminding them of what is our vision, right? And explaining to them and assuring them how their piece of the puzzle fits, right? So for example, when we had these really good bar pass rates, it was really easy to hold up our director of bar support and say, what an amazing job you did, right? And that's true, but it's also important to remind each and every one of our faculty members, right? That first year contracts course that you took was every bit as important to the success for our grads on the bar exam as what the director of bar support did in the last 3 months, right? And our student support staff, right? The fact that you helped that student with that leave of absence, or the fact that you made that registration process seamless for them, that gave them the encouragement to keep going, right? And, that student who had the ability to pass the bar didn't give up because of what you did for them, right? So connecting their day-to-day to that big picture vision to inspire them to keep going and to see their role as important. It's hard for me to remember to do that, but it's an important thing, and I have to constantly remind myself to do that, because I think that's what often gets lost is, there's the day-to-day and there's the big picture vision. And they talk about some leaders being, big picture leaders, right? They talk about some deans being external deans versus internal deans, right? You got to be both. You got to find a way to bridge that gap between the short-term and the long-term goals, or something's going to get lost and it's not going to work.
So you may have in that answer, you may have already answered this, but if you had to reflect on your own personal leadership skill set right now, what is for you biggest area of opportunity for you to grow and get better?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that, and I know that one off the top of my head. So I have to remember to give people praise, and this is a little different than what I talked about just a minute ago, right? About, it's one thing to say, hey, your job matters towards the big picture. I'm talking about when I edit someone's work, right? When I give feedback on, if I'm coaching a student for mock trial, right? It's very easy to say, hey, I noticed 8 things you did wrong, right? Here are the 8 things. There's 92 things you might have done right, but that's a given, right? So we've only got so much time. It's much more efficient for me to just, focus on the 8 things you did wrong. And I'm all about efficiency, right? I'm trying to squeeze a lot into my day. And it's true, that is the most efficient thing if your only focus is getting the most things done. Right. But what I have to remind myself, because this is not my nature, is it's the most efficient, but it's not the most effective. Right? Because if you're trying to, even the most cynical viewpoint, right? If you're trying to extract the best work product from someone, praising them for the things they did well is ultimately going to get more good work out of them. And so reminding myself about that's my biggest opportunity.
Yeah. That's good. I love that. Well, I want to be sensitive to time, so I'm going to throw out one last question here.
Sure.
And if you don't know, that's cool. But I always like to ask people, what is a question you wish people would ask you about that would give you the opportunity to talk about something? Because sometimes, what's true to you as a leader, some people don't ask you about, and it's like you wish they would, so it's an opportunity to shine. Any thoughts? What is a question you wish I would ask you or someone would ask you?
Not that question, because that's a tough question. That is tough. I think I wish people would ask me, gosh, I really don't know. I'm not even sure how to formulate the question, right? But it has something to do with, people ask about your leadership professionally. I think people would ask me, how does that connect to you personally, right? Like your personal values. I feel like that's not something that gets talked about. And my first instinct would be, well, that's really irrelevant, right? It doesn't really matter what my personal values are. But I think it does, right? I think, understanding the person helps understand the leader. So, yeah.
And what would the connection be then? How would you answer that then?
Yeah, so one of my big personal values is living up to your potential, right? And whether that's just, my personality, my upbringing, my, religious beliefs, whatever it may be. I remember when I was a kid and I was actually sort of neck and neck in competition to become valedictorian in my high school. And I remember asking my mom once, I'm like, why am I working so hard to be valedictorian? And she just said, because you can. That was the only explanation she ever gave, right? And that really stuck with me. And when I talk to employees, right, or we talk about like artificial intelligence is a big topic we're talking about all the time, as is lots of higher education. Right. And I say, look, I'm not opposed to using artificial intelligence in some ways, but at least for right now, we'll see what happens. But for right now, AI puts out B work, right? Puts out B-level work. And I said, we want A+ work in everything we do all the time. We owe it to our students. We owe it to the university. We owe it to ourselves. And I, don't usually talk about my own values when I'm talking about trying to, to do A+ work, but there really is a connection there. And it's a reminder to me, right, that I need to be more curious about my own, staff, my own employees, about what are their personal lives, what are their values, and that would probably make me a better leader. So actually, in retrospect, I am glad you asked the question, because even just thinking now, I'm seeing how I can be a better leader by asking other people what I would want them to ask about me. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. If someone wanted to learn more about Purdue Law, what would be the best way for them to learn more, be in touch? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, Purdue Global Law School, or www.purduegloballlawschool.edu, that has a lot of information. People can get in touch with an admissions advisor. We also have links there. I give webinars for prospective students where I answer questions personally about the school and about going to law school, right? And it's not a sales pitch per se, right? Sometimes I'm saying, hey, law school might not be the best fit for you given what you want to do, or our law school may not be the best fit for you because, you can't get licensed in the state you want to, whatever the case may be. But the website is a good starting point. And, like I always say, online law school is not for everyone, but for those who need it, it's a really important, really valuable option. And I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to help make that option available for folks who need it.
I love that. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much for being a guest with me today.
Thank
Ladies
you.
and gentlemen, thank you for listening or watching, however you get this. This is Inside the Leader's Mind, and I'm David Suson, and I hope you'll join us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take
Thanks,
care.
Martin.